Chapter 1. The Homecoming. The silence of the suburbs felt heavier than the silence of the desert. Elias Thorne stood on the manicured lawn of the house he had once called home, his duffel bag feeling like an anchor tethering him to a life that had seemingly moved on without him. The neighborhood was bathed in the soft, mocking glow of a late afternoon sun. Everything looked exactly as he had left it 3 years ago, yet everything felt alien. The fresh paint on the fence, the new SUV in the driveway, it was as if he were a ghost haunting the borders of a life that no longer had a room for him. He took a shaky breath, the air tasting sterile compared to the grit and diesel-choked winds of Iraq. He had spent years dreaming of this porch, of the creak of the front door, of the feeling of belonging. Now that he was finally here, his hands were trembling, not from fear of an IED, but from the terrifying uncertainty of the civilian life he had been so eager to reclaim. He reached for the doorbell, but his finger hovered frozen. Memories of gunfire and the metallic tang of blood threatened to drown out the chirping of the suburban birds. He took a slow, measured breath, grounding himself. Focus, Sergeant. One step at a time, he pressed the bell. The chime was bright, cheerful, and entirely out of place with the storm raging inside his chest. He heard footsteps behind the door, light, rapid, nothing like the heavy combat boots he had grown accustomed to. The door swung open. Sarah stood there, her hand still on the knob. She wore a casual sundress, her hair styled in a way he didn't recognize. She looked beautiful, but her eyes held a guarded, almost startled expression that stopped his heart mid-beat. Elias. Her voice was a thin thread of disbelief. You're early. He shifted his weight, his grip tightening on the strap of his bag. I wanted to surprise you, he said, his voice raspy from disuse. I'm home, Sarah. I'm finally home. He looked past her, searching for the small, bright face that had been his only solace in the dark nights of the desert. Where's Lily? Sarah didn't step back to let him in. Instead, she tightened her grip on the door, her knuckles turning white. She's at a friend's house. Elias, we need to talk. The coldness in her tone was sharper than any blade. The relief he had been carrying, the desperate hope that had pulled him through the long months of deployment, began to evaporate, replaced by a dull, aching dread. The war was over, but looking at his wife, Elias realized with a sickening clarity that he had just stepped into a different kind of battlefield. Chapter 2. The silent house. The hallway felt like a vacuum, sucking the air out of Elias's lungs. Sarah finally stepped aside, but she didn't offer a smile, a hug, or even a glass of water. She walked into the living room, her movements stiff, and Elias followed, the floorboards groaning under his weight, a sound that felt far too loud in the oppressive quiet. Everything had changed. The furniture was different, softer, lighter, expensive-looking pieces that didn't match the heavy oak table he had built with his own hands before he left. A large, abstract painting hung where his and Sarah's wedding photo used to be. The house felt like a showroom, sterile and curated, not the home he had left behind. You changed the place, Elias remarked, his voice echoing slightly. He placed his duffel bag on the floor, the thud resonating in the hollow silence. It's been 3 years, Elias, Sarah said, turning to face him. She stood by the kitchen island, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. Life moved on. I had to make the house feel like mine again. I couldn't just live in a shrine to someone who was half a world away. The words hit him like a physical blow. He reached out to touch the back of the sofa, a gesture of familiarity he was searching for, but his hand stopped mid-air. He looked at her, really looked at her. The softness he remembered in her face had hardened into a sharp, defensive edge. There was a distance in her eyes, 1,000 miles wide, that no deployment had ever created. I wasn't just away, Sarah. I was serving. I was fighting for this life, he countered, trying to keep his voice steady. The familiar urge to snap into a defensive tactical posture prickled at the back of his neck, a phantom response to the rising conflict. I know what you were doing, she snapped. But don't you dare act like the hero coming home to a grateful nation. You came home to a woman who had to figure out how to be a single mother, how to fix a leaking roof, how to pay the bills, and how to deal with the loneliness that ate at me every single night. Elias looked down at his boots, covered in the dust of the transition terminal, feeling like an intruder in his own life. He thought of the long, sleepless nights in the desert, where the thought of this kitchen, the way the morning light hit the counter, the smell of coffee, was the only thing that kept him from unraveling. To hear it dismissed as something Sarah had to live through, instead of wait for, felt like a betrayal deeper than any bullet wound. Here is Lily, He asked again, his voice lower, strained. I just want to see her. She's at her friend's house. Sarah repeated, her voice lacking any warmth. She poured herself a glass of wine, her hands moving with a practiced, restless energy. And, Elias, you can't just barge in here and expect things to go back to how they were. We aren't the same people we were 3 years ago. The house seemed to shrink around them. Elias felt the familiar tightening in his chest. The PTSD he had been suppressing with military discipline for years began to claw its way to the surface. The ticking of the wall clock sounded like a countdown. He remembered a patrol in Fallujah, the way the air would get heavy just before an ambush. The sensation was identical. I'm not asking for everything to be the same, he said, stepping toward the window to look out at the yard. The swing set he had bought for Lily was still there, but it looked weathered, the chains rusted from neglect. I'm just asking for a place to stand. For a chance to see my daughter. Sarah watched him, her expression unreadable. There was no pity there, only a cold, calculated distance that made Elias realize, for the first time, that he wasn't just fighting the war in his head, he was losing the war at home. Tonight, you sleep in the guest room, she said, cutting through his thoughts. Tomorrow, we talk about the future. And don't you dare try to see Lily until I decide it's appropriate. She's not used to you, Elias. You're a stranger to her. He looked at her, stunned. The word stranger hung in the air, heavier than any gear he had ever carried. He was a veteran of a brutal war, trained to lead men through hell, but standing in this quiet, decorated house, he felt completely and utterly disarmed. He watched Sarah walk out of the room, leaving him alone in the center of a life that no longer recognized him. The silence returned, thicker than before, suffocating him in the shadows of a home that was no longer his. Chapter 3. To the discovery. The guest room felt like a holding cell. It was decorated in muted tones, devoid of any personality, much like the rest of the house Sarah had transformed. Elias lay on the bed, staring at the ceiling, his mind refusing to settle. Every time he closed his eyes, the desert wind howled in his ears, and he could smell the burnt rubber and cordite that had defined his life for 3 years. He didn't sleep, he couldn't. The house was too quiet, yet it felt alive with secrets. Around 3:00 a.m. the thirst finally forced him out of bed. He crept into the hallway, his combat-trained senses already mapping the squeaky floorboards, a habit he couldn't just switch off. He moved silently toward the kitchen, but a light glow from the home office, a room he had barely entered since arriving, caught his eye. The door was slightly ajar. He didn't mean to spy, but as he passed, he saw Sarah's laptop sitting on the desk, left open. The screensaver was off. A notification pinged on the screen, a message from a sender named Mark. Elias froze. His heart, which had been racing since he stepped off the plane, seemed to stop entirely. He stepped closer, his rational mind screaming at him to turn away, to go back to the guest room and pretend he hadn't seen anything. But his feet wouldn't listen. He looked at the screen. The conversation history was there. It wasn't just a friendly chat. The tone was intimate, filled with plans, shared secrets, and language that made Elias's blood turn to ice. He's back, Sarah had written just hours ago. But it doesn't change anything. I told you I'm done with him. It's just a matter of making sure he doesn't take her. The world tilted. The walls of the office seemed to close in, and for a moment Elias felt the same crushing pressure he had felt during a mortar attack in Ramadi. He saw his own life, his own marriage, dismantled in a series of digital lines. It wasn't just that she had moved on. She had been planning his exclusion from their lives long before he had even packed his gear to leave Iraq. He heard a soft creak behind him. He spun around, his hands instinctively clenching into fists, a reflexive move that had saved his life a dozen times. Sarah stood in the doorway, wearing a silk robe, her eyes widening as she saw him standing by the desk, his hand hovering over the laptop. Elias. Her voice wasn't filled with shame, it was sharp with fury. What are you doing in here? Mark. Elias said, the name sounding like a curse on his lips. He didn't yell, his voice was eerily calm, the calm of a man who had seen enough destruction to know when a battle was already lost. How long? Sarah didn't stutter. She didn't try to hide it. She stepped fully into the room, crossing her arms. Long enough to realize I deserve to be happy, Elias. Long enough to know that you were never going to be the husband I needed. You could have told me, he said, his chest burning. You could have been honest. Honest. She laughed, a cold, jagged sound. You spent 3 years fighting a war thousands of miles away. You think you came home to a house, but you came home to a ghost. I stopped being your wife the day you signed up for that second extension. I had to live. I had to feel something other than the cold side of a bed. Elias looked at her, the woman he had promised to protect, the woman who had promised to wait. All the memories of his deployment, the sacrifices, the missed birthdays, the letters he had written in the dark, they all felt like ash in his mouth. And Lily? He asked, his voice barely a whisper. Does she know about him? She knows him as a friend, Sarah said, her voice turning icy. And that's all he'll ever be to her. But don't you dare think you can use this against me in court. I have been the one raising her. I have been the one providing stability. You are just a man with a gun and a history of nightmares. No judge is going to give you a child when you can barely hold yourself together. She walked past him, slamming the laptop shut and locking the office door behind her, leaving him standing in the hallway. Elias didn't move. He felt a strange clarity settling over him, a cold, hard resolve. He had fought enemies he could see, enemies that hid in the shadows of the desert, but he had never faced an enemy as calculated and cruel as this. He realized then that the fight wasn't about love anymore. It was about survival. And for the sake of his daughter, he would have to win this war, no matter the cost. Chapter 4: Shattered Foundations. The morning sun didn't bring warmth, it brought reality. Sarah didn't wait for breakfast. She had called her lawyer before the coffee had even finished brewing. By noon, a manila envelope sat on the kitchen counter like a ticking bomb. Elias watched her place it there, her face a mask of cold efficiency that he hadn't seen in the woman he married. I've filed for divorce, she said, not looking at him. And a temporary custody agreement. Until we settle this in court, you're out of this house. There's a motel on 4th Street. You'll stay there. Elias looked at the envelope, then at Sarah. The betrayal was no longer just a digital screen, it was now a legal document. And Lily, you're just gonna cut me off? I'm her father. You're a man she barely remembers. Sarah snapped, finally looking at him, her eyes devoid of empathy. The lawyer says 1 visit a month, supervised. Until I'm convinced you're not going to snap. I've heard about guys like you, Elias. The things you saw, the things you did. I won't have that energy around my daughter. The accusation felt like a serrated knife twisting in his gut. Guys like you. He had risked his life to ensure her safety, and now she was weaponizing his service against him. He felt the familiar surge of adrenaline, the fight response, but he forced it down, burying it deep beneath the cold, hard logic of survival. You're using my service as a weapon, he said, his voice dangerously low. You're painting me as a monster to justify what you've done. I'm protecting my child, she replied, her voice trembling slightly, but whether from fear or fury, he couldn't tell. Now, get your things. I don't want you here when she gets back from her friend's house. Packing his gear felt surreal. It was the same process he had done a dozen times in the military, organized, precise, emotionless. But this time, he wasn't packing to go to war. He was packing to leave everything he had fought for. His uniform, his medals, the few photos he had kept in his locker. They all felt like artifacts from a life that belonged to someone else. As he walked out the front door, the weight of his duffel bag was nothing compared to the hollowness in his chest. He stood on the porch for one last moment, looking at the overgrown grass of the front lawn. This was the home he had built. This was where he was supposed to grow old. He didn't look back as he drove away. The motel was a depressing, fluorescent, lit pit on the edge of town, smelling of bleach and stale cigarettes. He threw his bag onto the thin mattress and collapsed onto the edge of the bed. For the first time in years, the silence was absolute. No mission briefing, no mortar fire, no expectations. Just the hum of the aging air conditioner and the crushing realization that he had lost everything. He took out his wallet and looked at the photo of Lily, a snapshot from 4 years ago, her face smeared with ice cream, her smile wide and unburdened. He touched her face with his thumb, his vision blurring. He had survived the desert, survived the snipers, survived the hell of combat, only to be brought to his knees by the woman he had loved. He realized with a stark, terrifying certainty that he was fighting a war he wasn't prepared for. He was a soldier with no map, no backup, and no weapon. But as he stared at his daughter's face, a flicker of something long dormant flared in his eyes. It wasn't the blind fury of battle, it was the cold, calculated focus of a man who had decided he would not be erased. Sarah thought she could discard him, that she could label him as damaged goods and move on. She was wrong. He picked up the phone, staring at the screen. He needed to find a way to fight back. He needed someone who understood the language of this new battlefield. He reached out to an old contact, someone from the unit who had left the service long before him. The first month of his new life began with this single act of defiance. He was on his own, the world was against him, and he had nothing left to lose. And that, he realized, made him the most dangerous man in the world. Chapter 5. The motel room. The motel room was a study in decay, a liminal space between the life Elias had fought to return to and the ghost of the life he was currently living. The carpet was a tapestry of unidentifiable stains. The walls were thin enough to transmit the muffled arguments of neighbors and the relentless, aggressive roar of the interstate highway that sat only 50 yards away. The air conditioning unit was a beast of its own, rattling with a rhythmic, maddening metallic grinding that Elias had started to count, like a heartbeat that wasn't his own. Elias kept the room in rigid military order, despite the suffocating filth. His bed was made with hospital corners tight enough to bounce a coin. His duffel bag was packed and stood by the door, and his few civilian clothes hung in the closet with an unsettling, precise uniformity. It was a compulsion, a desperate psychological anchor designed to keep the chaos of his inner life from spilling over into the physical world. If the room was chaotic, he reasoned, he would be. If the room was orderly, maybe, just maybe, he could hold himself together. He didn't sleep. Sleep was the gateway to the things he couldn't control. Instead, he spent hours staring at the flickering light of the television, the sound muted, watching the static move like wind over the desert dunes. The silence in the room was never truly silent, it was alive with the echoes of his deployment. He could hear the crunch of boots on gravel, the sudden, sharp crack of sniper fire, and the voices of men whose names he recited like a prayer every night before he turned the lights out. His hand would often drift toward the cheap bottle of bourbon he'd purchased at the gas station, a dull, amber liquid that promised to blur the sharp edges of his memories. But every time his fingers brushed the glass, he saw Lily's face. He remembered the smell of her shampoo, the way she would laugh when he tossed her into the air, and the absolute, terrifying trust in her eyes. Not yet, he would whisper to the darkness, his voice raw. You can't fall apart. You can't let them be right about you. The nights were the most brutal. That was when the shadows stretched across the room, distorting into the shapes of the buildings he had cleared in Iraq, the doorways he had kicked open, and the terrified faces of the people he had tried to protect. He would wake up soaked in a cold, viscous sweat, his hand clawing at the mattress, reaching for a rifle that wasn't there. His heart would hammer against his ribs like a bird trapped in a cage, his breath coming in shallow, jagged gasps. He was a veteran of a war that the people in this town barely understood, a conflict that had left him with scars no one could see. He was a ghost in his own life, haunting a motel room that felt less like a temporary home and more like a tomb. He was waiting for a lifeline, but the silence remained thick and suffocating. He realized with a sickening clarity that he was trapped in a prison with no bars, the invisible, crushing weight of his own past. He closed his eyes, forcing himself to breathe, to find the discipline that had defined his identity for 3 years. He was still in the fight, even if the enemy was now just his own memory. He had to be, for Lily. Every morning, the light would crawl across the peeling wallpaper like a slow-moving interrogation, marking the start of another day of emptiness. Elias would force himself out of bed, his joints aching from the tension he held even in sleep. He would wash his face in the grimy sink, looking at a stranger in the mirror, a man with hollow eyes and a jaw set in a permanent, grim line. He had been a sergeant of Marines, a leader of men, a protector. Now, he was a man who checked his mailbox for letters that never came and looked at the clock, waiting for the one day a month that made his existence feel like something other than a mistake. He walked to the window and pulled back the curtain, watching the world go by outside. People were driving to jobs, taking their kids to school, living lives that seemed so effortlessly tethered to the ground. He felt like an astronaut who had crashed on an alien planet, unable to translate his experiences into their language. They wanted him to be a civilian, but they didn't know what it cost to be one after you'd seen the world burn to ash. He gripped the sill until his knuckles turned white. He couldn't stay here. He couldn't let this room be the final chapter of his story. He needed a plan, a strategy, a way to dismantle the wall Sarah had built between him and Lily. He began to pace the room, measuring the floorboards in his mind, his tactical training clicking back into place. Assess, orient, decide, act. That was the doctrine. He had to assess his situation. He was broke, he was broken, and he was being legally pushed out of his daughter's life. He needed to orient himself toward the truth, that Sarah's fear of him was a weapon she was using to keep her secrets safe. He had to decide to fight. And then, he had to act. He didn't know how yet, but he knew he wasn't going to spend another night in this room feeling like a ghost. He was Elias Thorne, and he was still a father. And that was the one mission he would never abort. Chapter 6:3. The only anchor. The day of the visit was the only day of the month that held any color, the only day the sun didn't feel like an interrogation light. Elias had spent the entire morning preparing, driven by a ritualistic need to prove his worth. He scrubbed the motel's stained sink until his knuckles were raw, trying to wash away the scent of neglect that seemed to cling to his skin. He shaved until his face burned, a razor, thin margin between cleanliness and blood, and put on his best button-down shirt, the one Sarah had bought him years ago, a piece of fabric that carried the faint, lingering ghost of a happier life. He checked his reflection in the cracked, distorted mirror, carefully smoothing the deep, entrenched lines of exhaustion on his face. He didn't want to look like the broken man from the motel room. He wanted to look like the father Lily deserved, a man of strength, safety, and unwavering love. The visitation center was a sterile, soulless building located on the outskirts of town, a place designed to keep the world away from the people who were already being erased. It smelled of floor wax and stale coffee, a scent that triggered a sharp phantom pain in his chest. Sarah brought Lily into the room, her expression guarded and clinical, her eyes darting over Elias as if checking for signs of explosive violence. She didn't offer a greeting, nor did she acknowledge his presence beyond the absolute necessity of the transfer. She dropped Lily off in a flurry of nervous energy and retreated to the designated waiting area, leaving them alone in the quiet, plastic-chaired room. Lily was 6 now, an age he felt he had missed entirely, his memory of her frozen at 4. Her hair was braided in a style he didn't recognize, and she wore a dress that felt unfamiliar. She sat across from him, small and uncertain, her hands folded in her lap like she was waiting for a teacher to tell her what to do. The silence between them was not the suffocating silence of the motel, but a fragile, aching space waiting to be filled. "Hi, Lily," Elias said, his voice cracking, the raw edges of his anxiety softened by the sheer sight of her. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, wooden horse he had spent 3 weeks carving in the dark, his hands working by feel, memorizing the shape of the wood. "I brought you something. I was hoping you might like it." Lily took the toy, her small, delicate fingers tracing the smooth grain of the wood. A smile, slow and hesitant, blossomed on her face, illuminating the entire room. "It's pretty, Daddy. Did you make it all by yourself?" "I did," he said, the lump in his throat making it nearly impossible to speak. "I thought of you every single time I worked on it. Every day." For the next hour, they didn't talk about Iraq, or the court documents, or the crushing reality of his life. They talked about her favorite cartoons, the color of her new crayons, and the way she liked to put extra sprinkles on her ice cream. It was a fragile, precious hour, a bubble of normality in the midst of his crumbling world. He soaked in every word, every gesture, every flicker of light in her eyes, memorizing her like he used to memorize maps before a mission. When the time was up, and Sarah walked in to collect her, the shift was instantaneous. The light went out of Lily's face. She clung to his hand for a second longer than the rules allowed, her small grip pulling at his heartstrings. "Can we do this again, Daddy?" she asked, her voice quiet but clear. "Every chance I get," he promised, his promise carrying the weight of a solemn oath. "I'm not going anywhere." As he watched them leave, the door clicking shut behind them, Elias felt a fire ignite in his chest, a slow, steady, and unyielding burn. It wasn't the volatile heat of combat, but the cold, focused coal of purpose. Sarah had taken his home, his reputation, and his peace of mind, but she couldn't touch this. He was a father. That was a title that meant more than any medal or citation he had ever received. And as he walked back to his car, he knew he would tear the world apart to keep that title alive. Chapter 7. Descent into darkness. The weeks following that visit were a slow, agonizing grind of failure. Elias tried to claw his way back into society, but the world felt entirely out of sync with the man he had become. He couldn't hold down a job, his hands shook whenever he was forced to focus for too long, his attention was constantly fractured by the sudden, intrusive flashbacks of the desert, and his temper was a hair trigger waiting for the slightest spark. He was fired from a warehouse job after he pinned a foreman against a cold steel wall for making a disparaging, ignorant comment about the military. He didn't feel anger in those moments. He felt a terrifyingly numb disconnection, a reflex that was older and deeper than his own willpower. The motel room began to feel like a coffin, a place where he was being buried alive one day at a time. He stopped keeping it clean. The empty bottles began to pile up, their amber glass glowing in the dim, sickly light of the television. The memories of the war, once just ghosts in the background, now felt like predators sitting in the corners of the room, watching him lose his grip. He was losing the battle with himself, and the darkness was creeping in, promising a quick, final end to the relentless, throbbing pain. Every day, the sense of failure compounded. He would wake up and stare at the wall, paralyzed by the sheer enormity of his isolation. He had been a man who led others through the most dangerous zones on the planet, but he was currently unable to navigate a single day of civilian life without falling apart. The simple tasks, grocery shopping, filling out an application, answering a phone, felt like tactical maneuvers he was destined to lose. Each rejection, each moment of incompetence, was a nail in the coffin of his self-esteem. He skipped the next visitation. The shame was a physical weight, a barrier he couldn't cross. He couldn't bear to let Lily see him like this, hollow-eyed, shaking, fueled by a self-loathing that burned like acid. He was failing the only person who truly mattered, and the thought was a splinter in his mind that he couldn't pull out. He sat on the floor of the darkened room, a bottle in his hand, wondering if Sarah was right all along. Maybe he was just a broken relic of a war that had no place in the world. Maybe his existence was just a lingering injury, one that never properly healed. He was drowning, and there was no one left to reach for. The silence of the room was completely replaced by the roar of the desert, the screams of the fallen, and the crushing realization that he had squandered his last chance. He was a soldier who had survived the most brutal conditions on Earth, only to lose himself in the wreckage of his own life. The darkness felt warm, inviting, and for the first time, he let it pull him under, welcoming the numbness as he drifted toward the edge of his own sanity. He wasn't even fighting the ghosts anymore. He was just sitting there, waiting for them to finish the job. The bottle was his only companion, and the static on the TV was the only music he could stand. He was gone, a casualty of a war that refused to end, a man who had lost his map, his squad, and finally his daughter. He was drifting into the abyss, and for a fleeting, terrifying moment, he didn't care if he ever came back. Chapter 8. A ghost from the past. The door didn't just knock. It buckled under a heavy, train boot, the lock shattering with a sound that echoed like a gunshot in the cramped room. Elias, slumped in the darkened corner with his back against the peeling wallpaper, didn't even look up. He didn't have the energy to move, nor did he have the will to care who had invaded his sanctuary of self-destruction. He expected the police, or perhaps just another cruel trick of his own failing, decaying mind. "Get up, Thorne!" The voice was rough, familiar, a gravelly tone that had shouted orders over the roar of a Humvee engine in the heat of Iraq. It was a voice from a life he had tried to bury. Marcus Reed stood in the doorway, his silhouette blocking out the harsh hallway light. He scanned the room with the clinical, unblinking detachment of a man who had seen too many scenes, exactly like this one in the back alleys of cities he couldn't even name. He walked over, kicked the empty bottle aside with a look of utter contempt, and grabbed Elias by the collar, hauling him up with a strength born of years of shared hardship and absolute resolve. "Look at you." Max spat his face inches from Elias's, his eyes burning with an intensity that forced Elias to blink. "You're an embarrassment to the uniform. You're an embarrassment to every single man who didn't come home. Every single one of them would have given anything to be sitting in this chair. Even if it was a shithole like this. Do you hear me?" Elias struggled, a weak, pathetic attempt to push away, but Mac was stronger, his grip iron-clad, immovable. "Let me go," he rasped, his voice sounding like dry, dead leaves skittering across pavement. "I'm done, Mac. You don't understand. I'm dead already." "You're just talking to a ghost." "I understand plenty," Mac retorted, throwing him back against the wall with enough force to rattle his teeth and snap his head back. "I understand what it's like to lose everything. I understand the weight, the crushing guilt, the way the silence eats you until there's nothing left. But I didn't crawl through the dirt in Iraq just to watch you die in a filthy, piss-smelling motel room." "You have a daughter, man!" "You have a reason to stand up. You're going to let that woman win. You're going to let her turn your kid into someone who forgets you even existed. Someone who thinks her father was just a coward who quit. Elias looked at him, the thick, toxic haze of alcohol finally beginning to recede under the raw, unfiltered fury in Mac's eyes. He saw the scars on Mac's own face, the wariness that never truly left his posture, and he realized he wasn't the only one who had come home to nothing. She's already won, Mac, Elias whispered, his voice trembling as the reality of his situation crashed back in his brain. Look at this place. Look at me, I'm empty. There's nothing left to save. Then look at me, Mac shouted, his hand gripping Elias's shoulder until it bruised, pinning him to the reality of the moment. I'm not leaving until you're clean. I'm not leaving until we get your head straight. We're in this together. That was the promise, remember? No men left behind. That isn't just for the battlefield, and it sure as hell doesn't end when you take the uniform off. For the first time in months, Elias felt something other than the cold, isolating sting of despair. He felt the crushing, heavy weight of a brother's presence, a force that demanded he acknowledge he wasn't alone. He saw Mac's jaw set, that same stubborn, unwavering defiance that had kept them both alive under fire. And as Mac started cleaning the room, aggressively tossing the empty bottles into a trash bag and pulling the curtains open to let the harsh, unforgiving morning light flood in, Elias realized the fight wasn't over. It had just changed fronts. He was in the war of his life, and for the first time in a long time, he finally had his squad back. The ghost of the past hadn't come to bury him, it had come to rescue him. Chapter 9 Tree The intervention wasn't gentle. It was a systematic, brutal reconstruction of a man who had forgotten how to stand. Mac didn't offer sympathy or soft words. He operated with the same cold efficiency he had used in the field, treating Elias's trauma like a mechanical failure that needed to be diagnosed and corrected. He didn't let Elias sleep until he had showered, scrubbed the grime of his depression off, eaten a real meal, and walked 3 miles in the biting, cold morning air. Mac was relentless, his own life seemingly set aside to ensure Elias didn't drift back into the void. They sat on the edge of the sagging mattress as the sun rose, the golden, unforgiving light revealing the deep, jagged exhaustion etched into both their faces. 2 men who had seen too much and were now trying to make sense of a world that felt fundamentally incompatible with them. Why are you doing this, Mac? Elias asked, his voice still carrying the tremor of his recent descent, his hands finally steady as he held a cup of black coffee that tasted, for the first time, like salvation. Mac looked out the window at the bleak, gray landscape of the interstate, his jaw tight. Because I saw what happened to our guys, Elias. I saw them when they got back, and I saw them fade away, one by one, because they had nothing to come home to. They were hollowed out by the war, and the world just let them drift. You have Lily, that makes you lucky, even if you don't feel like it. Don't you dare throw that away. You are the only person left who can be her father. She thinks I'm a monster, Mac, Elias said, the bitterness rising in his chest. Sarah has poisoned Lily against me. She's winning the narrative, and she's doing it by making me the villain in her version of the story. Then you prove her wrong, Mac said, his voice dropping into that calm, authoritative tone he used when briefing the squad. Not with words, not with anger, and definitely not with the shit you've been doing for the last month. You prove her wrong by being the man she thought she was marrying. You get a job, you stay clean, you show up every single time, no matter what she throws at you. You become the boring, stable, reliable civilian dad. You be so consistent, so calm, and so present that you bore her into letting you back into their lives. You make it impossible for a judge to see anything but a good father. And if she still fights, if she uses the courts to lock me out forever, Mac leaned in, his eyes hard as flint, devoid of doubt. Then we fight back. We do it legal, we do it clean, and we do it until she has nowhere left to turn. We use the law like we used air support: precision, timing, and relentless pressure. But it starts with you. You take the first step, or I'm not staying. Elias looked at his friend, a man who had seen the same horrors, and yet had managed to find a way to live. He realized he had been waiting for permission to fight, waiting for a leader to tell him what to do. He didn't need a leader anymore. He needed to be one. He stood up, his posture shifting, the soldier returning to the surface, the fog in his mind clearing to reveal a singular, crystalline focus. I'm in, Elias said, his voice firm for the first time since he came home. Good, Mac replied, standing up to join him, his expression finally softening into a brief, grim smile. Because the war doesn't end just because you leave the field. It ends when you win. And we're gonna win. Chapter 10. The first step. The change was not immediate, but it was absolute. Elias started with the small things, the foundational discipline that had once been his entire life. He stopped drinking, replacing the void with a grueling regimen of exercise and study. Mac found him a job at a local mechanic shop, a dusty, grease-stained place where no one cared about his service record, and where the work was honest and hard. His muscles ached, but the pain was grounded, real, and welcomed. It reminded him he was still capable of output, still functional, still alive. He started reading, not about the war, but about the law. He visited the public library every night, his worn combat jacket a stark contrast to the quiet, academic atmosphere. He began to learn the language of family court custody, visitation, rights, evidence. It was a new kind of reconnaissance, and he approached it with the same tactical focus he had used to map enemy movements in the desert. He was learning how to build a case, how to document, how to be patient, and how to operate within a system that felt stacked against him. He started visiting the park near Lily's house, not to approach her, he knew that would be a mistake, but just to sit and watch, to remind himself of the goal. He saved every penny, putting it aside for a lawyer who wouldn't just take his money, but one who would understand his story and fight for the truth. He was building a foundation, brick by brick. One evening after a long, draining shift at the shop, he sat in his clean, quiet motel room. The air felt lighter, the space no longer filled with the ghosts of his descent, but with the quiet potential of a new beginning. He looked at the wooden horse he had carved, then at the thick binder of legal research he had compiled over the last month. He was far from where he wanted to be, and he was still a stranger to his own life, but for the first time, he saw a path forward. He was no longer a man adrift in the shadows of his own past. He was a father with a mission. He picked up the phone and dialed the number of the lawyer Mac had recommended, the one who handled the tough cases, the one who looked for the truth behind the paperwork. "My name is Elias Thorne," he said, his voice steady and clear, carrying the weight of a man who had looked into the abyss and refused to blink. "And I'm gonna win back my daughter." The first step was taken. The rest of the war was yet to come, but as he sat in the dim light of the room, Elias knew he was ready. He was finally, truly, coming home. The long winter of his soul was ending. The battle for Lily had begun, and this time, he was not going to be the one who lost.